Key facts about the Vietnam War. The 7-year conflict, called the Vietnam War in America and the American War in Vietnam, was actually the American phase of the Second Indochina War. The war always included the other two former states of French Indochina, Laos and Cambodia, as well as North and South Vietnam. It began well before the U.S. entry in 1965 and continued after the U.S. withdrawal in 1973. The officially named Republic of Vietnam, or RVN, South Vietnam, and the officially named Democratic Republic of Vietnam, the DRV, or North Vietnam, were both sovereign nations, not one nation with two names. Like the two Koreas, North and South, and the two Germanys, East and West, both of the two Vietnams were diplomatically recognized as independent nations. At various times and places in South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, the war did have some of the characteristics of an insurgency or a civil war. But a war between two nations is not a civil war, and the invasion of one nation by the armed forces of another nation is not an insurgency. The North Vietnamese Army, the NVA, and their Viet Cong subordinates, the VC, were indirectly controlled by Le Duan, the leader of the Political Bureau, or Politburo, of the communist regime in North Vietnam. Le Duan's strategic objective was always the military conquest of South Vietnam by the NVA and the establishment of North Vietnamese hegemony in Laos and Cambodia. During most of the war, the NVA had 6 strategic advantages. 1. A constant supply of Soviet and Chinese war material. 2. Politically protected ports in North Vietnam. 3. Politically protected supply routes and base areas in Laos and Cambodia. 4. No fear of a U.S. strategic expansion of the war into Laos, Cambodia, or North Vietnam after 1968. 5. No political opposition in their Stalinist police state. And 6. A callous willingness to continue incurring enormous casualties with increasingly younger troops for no permanent military gain. With those 6 advantages, the Politburo leaders were willing to gamble that their ability to prolong the war militarily was greater than the U.S. president's ability to prolong it politically. The offensive total war long-term strategy of the resolute Politburo was superior to the defensive limited war short-term strategy of the vacillating U.S. president from 1964 to 1968. The Politburo leaders knew they could never defeat the capacity of the U.S. military to win large-scale battles, but they believed they eventually could defeat the political will of the U.S. to continue protecting South Vietnam. They knew that the key to a long-term strategic victory over the tactically superior U.S. forces was simply surviving to buy time. They originally identified and consistently exploited the key U.S. strategic vulnerability. It was the inevitable rejection by the U.S. Congress of a congressionally undeclared, ambiguously defined, indefinitely prolonged, and increasingly costly war in a place that most Americans considered insignificant. The Politburo correctly anticipated that, as in France in the early 1950s, the U.S. war in Vietnam would eventually be condemned by the U.S. media as an unnecessary and unwinnable military misadventure of questionable morality and doubtful national security value. From 1959 to 1971, the war was an incremental invasion of South Vietnam by the NVA and the VC in 2 stages. The first stage was the clandestine, gradual infiltration of thousands of South Vietnamese communists who moved to North Vietnam in 1954. They were veterans of the First Indochina War against the French from 1946 to 1954. In 1959, the Politburo ordered them to begin to infiltrate back into South Vietnam to conduct political indoctrination and terrorism in rural areas and small-scale guerrilla warfare against local government forces. The second stage was the clandestine incremental invasion of increasingly large NVA units into South Vietnam to organize, train, and lead combined NVA and VC troops in mobile, semi-conventional warfare against vulnerable government forces. If the U.S. military and its allies had not intervened in 1965, the VC and NVA would have defeated the poorly equipped and poorly led South Vietnamese army. In 1968, most of the VC combat forces were killed or captured by U.S. and RVN forces in nationwide urban battles, and the VC survivors were no longer a strategic threat to the Republic of Vietnam. From 1965 to 1973, U.S. forces took every significant position they were ordered to take, defended every significant position they were ordered to defend, and killed at least 10 times as many VC and NVA troops as they lost to the enemy troops. The NVA finally won the Second Indochina War because the U.S. gradual attrition tactics were limited to South Vietnam, and the U.S. forces never had any strategic military objectives to decisively defeat the main enemy, the North Vietnamese Army. U.S. Army and Marine forces did not fight a 7-year strategic war for Indochina and lose. They fought a 1-year tactical war for South Vietnam 7 times, won it every year, and were withdrawn for U.S. political reasons. The third stage of the war was an overt invasion of South Vietnam in 1972 by regular Soviet-equipped NVA divisions, using the same conventional tactics that North Korea used in its 1950 invasion of South Korea. The rejuvenated South Vietnamese forces alone, supported only by U.S. air power, defeated and repelled the NVA invasion forces. In 1973 and 1974, the U.S. Congress rejected the constantly increasing costs of an apparently endless war of partial escalation and de-escalation. They denied vital military supplies to the South Vietnamese armed forces and prohibited U.S. air support to enforce the 1973 Paris Peace Accords. In 1975, 300,000 regular troops of the modern Soviet-equipped North Vietnamese Army, supported by 500 tanks, mechanized long-range artillery, and surface-to-air missiles, invaded South Vietnam again and conquered it conventionally with no concern for civilian hearts and minds and no need for VC guerrillas. It was a strategic defeat both for the Republic of Vietnam and for U.S. foreign policy, but it was not a tactical defeat for U.S. military forces which had been withdrawn from Vietnam 2 years earlier. After the communist conquests of South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in 1965, it was estimated that more people were executed by the communists as class enemies, drowned trying to escape from Vietnam by sea, or killed by starvation, disease, exposure, and exhaustion in communist concentration camps than all the people who were killed in the combat of the war itself. The U.S. military could have protected the Republic of Vietnam indefinitely without stationing any U.S. troops there, merely by providing adequate war supplies to the South Vietnamese armed forces and combat air support for them from U.S. bases in Thailand and Guam, as they successfully did in 1972. The widely held but non-factual belief that U.S. combat forces were defeated in Vietnam by communist military forces is dangerous, both for world peace and for U.S. strategic interests. It encourages criminal rulers like Saddam and international terrorists like bin Laden to believe that because U.S. forces were, quote, defeated in Vietnam by VC guerrillas, end quote, U.S. forces today can be defeated by Islamic guerrillas and terrorists. Neither of those beliefs is factual, yet wars are being fought today partly because of such non-factual beliefs about the military facts of the U.S. phase of the Second Indochina War. The overt and increasingly bitter Cold War in America today between cultural traditionalists and militant leftist progressives is partly an outgrowth of the ideological schism originating in the anti-war movements of the mid-1960s and early 1970s. That schism has been maintained, whether ignorantly or deliberately, by the institutionalized distortion and suppression of the key military facts of the Second Indochina War by most of the U.S. education, entertainment, and media elites. Objective facts about the military aspects and the militarily relevant political aspects of the Second Indochina War can be found in at least 4 books. Philip Davidson's Vietnam at War, Louis Sorley's A Better War, Harry Summers' Historical Atlas of the Vietnam War, and Lien Hang Thi Nguyen's Hanoi's War. No one can properly understand the so-called Vietnam War without a knowledge of the basic military and political facts explained in those and a few other factually complete histories. Thank you.